Good evening. New session with MCF and the Public Affairs section of the U.S. Embassy. We have a new topic this time regarding U.S. policies, priorities, and trivialities in Lebanon. We have guests from Washington, D.C., Dr. Joseph Jbaili, President of the Lebanese Information Center in the U.S., Ambassador Gerald Feinstein, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, former Ambassador to Yemen, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and also joining us from Washington, Dr. Robert Danan, Principal, Georgetown Global Strategies, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs as well, former Director for the Levant White House National Security Council. Also, thanks for joining us. And it will join us later, Joel Rayburn, Fellow, New American Foundation, and visiting fellow, and he was special envoy to Syria in the last administration. Definitely the topic is going to be related about Lebanon, U.S. policies, new administration that took office about 2 years ago with President Biden. And the new changes, definitely Ukraine also made things harder and harder to follow on the matters in the Middle East. Dr. Jbaili, first of all, do you think that the U.S. priority shifted 100% for what's really happening in Ukraine today?
I think the interest regarding the matter of the Middle East is still there. Of course, because of this major crisis in Ukraine, there will be more effort and more time spent on dealing with the Ukraine crisis, but it doesn't mean that the eyes of Washington are off of the Middle East situation. And we're seeing visits, we're seeing meetings, for example, regarding the Abraham Accord and other meetings happening by senior officials, visits to the Middle East. And there's also the fact that the Middle East is somewhat affected by the situation in Ukraine. So I don't believe that the crisis in Ukraine made the administration forget about the Middle East.
We always have a confusion here in the Middle East, or especially in Lebanon, toward the policy of the U.S. in Lebanon. What is the policy of this administration? If you can make it clear to us, please.
Well, I think you've put a number of questions already on the table. I mean, one, I agree with Joe, in the sense that I don't think the administration actually has done a 100% U-turn. What strikes me, first of all, at the biggest level of generality is the amount of continuity that we've seen over the last three administrations. What we're seeing is an administration that's not leaving the Middle East, contrary to popular belief, but that's trying to do more with less resources, as it were, and trying to scale down what is called here, never-ending wars. And so we've seen, the United States scale back its presence in Iraq dramatically. We've seen it withdraw from Afghanistan, but we're not seeing a withdrawal from the region at all. So at the most general level, I would say, that's one misperception I'd like to strike. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, just a couple days ago described the U.S. policy as being, basically, as we approach Ramadan, he said, we welcome the proactive diplomacy underway by our friends and partners in the region. And, he said that the agenda is to forge a more secure and integrated Middle East through a combination of deterrence against adversaries and diplomacy wherever possible to reduce tensions and de-escalate ongoing conflicts. And so, I think from that we can, learn that the ambitions of the administration are not huge, in the sense that this is not an administration that's out to remake the region, that's not out to solve major fundamental problems in the region. It's seeking to use diplomacy to scale down and ease tension and de-escalate conflicts. That's I think that's a fair description.
Robert,
of
is it part of the diplomacy
goal
to negotiate the Iranian nuclear deal without including the proxies of Iran in the region that are not making this region stable?
I think we have to understand and revisit what the negotiations are that are taking place in Vienna. I mean, these are negotiations to reconstitute the JCPOA, which is, a very structured and limited agreement focused on Iran's nuclear program. It does not address Iran's other delivery systems, the missile problem that is of concern to so many in the Middle East. It does not address Iran's foreign policy or its expansion or expansionist behavior. So none of those issues are addressed. And so it's right, to be disappointed by that. And I think that's why the administration has taken a bit of a different approach, at least stylistically, in approaching these negotiations. I mean, you've seen a lot, I think, since the onset of the administration in 2021, a lot of active diplomacy to consult with regional partners, both in the Arab world and in Israel, in order precisely to try to at least address their concerns, since they are not parties to these negotiations or these agreements.
Thank you, Robert. I'll come back to you and really dig more into that matter. Let me try this again. Ambassador, we're talking here about policy, U.S. policy in Lebanon. Does this policy has a clear vision?
Well, I think it does have a clear vision. And I think, again, and just to echo what Joe and Rob said, there is a consistency to the approach of this administration compared to its predecessors, both the Trump and Obama administrations before it. I think that in the case of Lebanon, what you see is a basic commitment on the part of the United States to try to address the issues of security and stability, long-standing commitment to help strengthen the Lebanese armed forces to carry out their mission of safeguarding Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think that certainly since the collapse of the Lebanese economy over these last months and years, you've seen the U.S. and again both the current administration and its predecessor making commitments to try to work with the political establishment in Lebanon to address these critical issues and to encourage Lebanon to make the decisions that are necessary in order to rebuild its economy, gain the confidence of the international financial organizations, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, in order to help stabilize the situation there, and recognizing that these issues, these economic issues, and the issues of territorial integrity and sovereignty, especially with the civil war raging next door in Syria, are fundamental concerns and issues that challenge the future of Lebanon. I would also say that, again, consistent with its predecessors, the Biden administration has worked very closely with partners, with the French, with Saudi Arabia, and with others, with the intent of trying to put together an international consensus on how to move forward with Lebanon and how to work with Lebanon in order to address all these issues. So again, I think that the theme here is really continuity and clear commitment on the part of the U.S. To stand with our friends and partners in Lebanon.
Ambassador, like the Russian invasion to Ukraine, I was asking Joseph Jbaili, do you think that also made the priority of the U.S. shift more toward that region, or what's really happening globally, instead of just focusing what's really happening in Lebanon and this corrupted government that never changed his behavior?
Well, certainly, as Joe said quite correctly, obviously, if you are here in Washington, you understand the complete focus of the administration and more broadly of the U.S. government and the people in what's happening in Ukraine. This is a tragedy and a disaster for the entire global community. But I would also agree with Joe that in the old saying, the U.S. government can walk and chew gum at the same time. That there are still many people who are focused on what's going on in the Middle East, who are working diligently to try to advance our policy objectives in the Middle East. That doesn't change, even though there's a crisis elsewhere in the world. And the other point that I would make is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are that there is an intersection between what happens in the Middle East and what's happening in the Ukraine right now. I mean, you could look, for example, I mean, the clearest example is the issue of food security and the fact that that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, taking a huge portion of the global supply of wheat off the market, is going to affect security and stability throughout the Middle East. Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world, and this is going to have a huge impact. I think we also need to look at the role that Russia is playing in the conflict in Syria and recognize that in many ways, what is happening in Ukraine is a continuation of the Russian intervention in Syria from several years ago. The methods that they're using in Ukraine are the same methods that they used in Aleppo and elsewhere. Of course, part of it is that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine and succeeds in expanding its territorial hold in Eastern Europe, that will also have spillover effects in Turkey and Iraq and in the Levant. So we can't look at these things in isolation.
For sure, for sure. Joseph Jbaili, this question is for you. You have friends from Republican Party and Democrat Party, and in every administration, you've been always touring, advocating for Lebanon, asking what's best for Lebanon. I want to ask you that, and I want to hear a frank answer from your side, Joseph. Who was serving better Lebanon or Lebanese interest, the Biden administration so far or the Trump administration?
So one, I would again echo what my other co-panelists said about there is the continuity, which is very important, and the great objectives of the different administrations. I mean, when they talk, I mean, all the administration have been talking about the need for securing Lebanon's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, of implementing Security Council Resolution 1559, 1680, 1701, disbanding all militias, controlling borders with Syria, expanding state authority. This has been a continuous position from the Bush administration. I mean, I've dealt with the U.S. policymakers since the end of the Clinton administration, 1999. So I've lived throughout these various administrations, and I can say from the Bush administration on, there has been this consistent, principles in approaching the matter of Lebanon and what is in the interest of the United States when it comes to Lebanon policies. Now, of course, every administration has different style, and we know that the president, depending on his philosophy, on his beliefs, etc., because the president is the one that has, I mean, it's the purview of the president, foreign policy is. So yes, we see differences between one administration and another. But again, I mean, what I would add regarding this administration in particular, when we talk about, okay, what's the difference between, let's say, Trump administration and this one? There are two major elements which have to do also with the situation on the ground, because the explosion of the economic crisis, I mean, what the World Bank described as being among the top 3 worst crises worldwide since the 1850s. This, of course, had forced the hands of the administration to approach Lebanon differently. So, for example, at the end of 2021, the White House press briefing at the end of the year, talking about the situation in the Middle East, when mentioning Lebanon, the main theme was, we do not want another failed state. And I've heard it directly from officials I deal with. They're looking at Lebanon as a possible failed state. So a priority now is to prevent this from happening through mainly the aid. So assistance today, particularly humanitarian assistance, which was not, if you look at previous administrations, which may not have been the priority. Now it is a priority. The other thing that I would say has also changed and is becoming, I guess, a welcome approach is that the President Biden, made fighting corruption as a core national U.S. Priority when it comes to foreign policy. So and this is why, and this has been mentioned repeatedly when talking about Lebanon, is the matter of corruption in Lebanon will be addressed. And there has been some designations. Some of them were done during the Trump administration. There have been more also during this administration. We've heard from Treasury and different visits to Lebanon talking about the need to fight corruption, the need to go after the accounts of what we call PEPs, the politically exposed persons, etc. So corruption is now also, I think, a big priority for this administration. That's what I would say would be the major differences.
Joel Rayburn join us right now. Joel, how are you? Actually, I was asking Joseph Bailey, Ambassador Feinstein, and Robert Dallin, since you worked under Trump's administration, do you see any real vision of any kind of policy that has been giving to Lebanon?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the Trump administration formulated a policy, but then didn't have the time to carry it out. And I think probably we were slow off the mark in clarifying the policy. Secretary Pompeo made his visit to Beirut in the spring of 2019, and he went with an ultimatum to the Lebanese political class, which was saying, listen, you guys have to make a choice. You can't continue on to be political enablers of Hezbollah, to be in political alliances with Hezbollah, and then expect to be treated distinctly from Hezbollah when it comes to U.S. sanctions and overall and U.S. support. You can't be friends with both us and Hezbollah when there's this escalating confrontation between the Quds Force and Hezbollah on one side and the U.S. and its allies on the other in the region. And I would say that the Lebanese political class didn't respond to that ultimatum. And then 6 months later, the financial meltdown. Essentially what Secretary Pompeo, who had the lead for this file in the Trump administration, was saying was, if you don't dissociate yourself from Hezbollah politically, then we're going to treat you as an enabler of Hezbollah, and we're going to start sanctioning you. And that started to happen with, Ali Hassan Khalil and eventually Gibran Bassil and Yusuf Finyanos and so on. But I would say that it came together too late to have an impact during the time of the Trump administration. I think it was the right approach, but it was too late. And then I would say also at the end of the Trump administration that the French came in with a different approach. And so we had competing approaches going on at the same time, and it was a bit incoherent. And I think that didn't help matters. It would have been better for the United States and France to be on the same page. It would ideally that the French would be on our page. Because frankly, I think their approach, which involves kind of locking in, which involves basically recognizing the validity of those same political alliances between Hezbollah and the other factions, I think that's the wrong-headed approach. I don't think Lebanese people support it either. That's my take on the Trump administration.
Joe, what about this administration? Is it a continuity for what Trump started? What's your take?
Well, I think I agree with Joe that there's been a long-standing principle of trying to support the independence of Lebanon as a nation and to support the Lebanese people to get out from under being, sort of vassalage of the Syrian regime or the Iranian regime or anybody else. But I have to think, we have to look at the situation in 2022 and say that we have the right policy goal, but the means that we're using to try to get there are not working, and things are in a deeper hole than before.
What's not working? Let's be more clear. What's not working for this administration in terms of this policy and its goal?
Well, since 2005, the United States has been trying to reduce the political power of Hezbollah and the Iranian regime and the Assad regime in Lebanon. And 17 years later, all three of those have more power than before. In 2005, the Bush administration compelled the Assad regime to abandon Lebanon altogether, and now today they're back politically. And you have to say that Hezbollah and the Iranian regime have even more of a stranglehold on Lebanese politics than they did in 2005. At that point, they were just they were a spoiler. Now they're the dominant force. So whatever we've been trying to do has obviously not had the effect, and we've been a little bit all over the map in terms of our specific actions. There's some things happening now. There are a couple of really very important geopolitical factors that are developing that are going to eventually have an impact on the Middle East and on the situation in Lebanon. Some in a good way, some in a bad way. And there are also a couple of opportunities. But the first one is we're witnessing the collapse of Russian military power and the collapse of Russia's ability to project military power beyond its borders. And that's something of world historical significance. It's going to have a ripple effect in the Middle East. It's going to have a ripple effect on the situation in Syria, where, for example, the Russians have been exposed to be so militarily weak that they will not be able to reinforce their allies and clients in any theater outside Russia and Ukraine anytime soon. If we think what they've been able to do for the Assad regime over the last 11 years, they don't have the means to do that and go up the escalatory ladder in a confrontation with Turkey or Israel or anybody else now. And that's going to have an impact on Middle Eastern politics and on Assad's fate and on the situation in Lebanon as well.
Yes.
So that's to the good. To the bad is if the United States, if the U.S. administration goes forward with entering into a nuclear agreement with the Iranians that winds up unfreezing tens of billions of dollars of cash
without
to the Iranians.
Without addressing the proxies, correct?
Exactly, yeah.
So I want to go back to this point because I want to expand my conversation about this topic, and because this is very important for Lebanon and has lots of impact in the future. Robert Denon, you also have a lot of friends in Washington are Lebanese. So when you have different opinions coming to lobby for the interests of Lebanon, how the government of the U.S. will take them seriously? Like, for example, let's say, for example, people from the parliament, from Nabih Berri, are coming to lobby for his interest. And you have some people coming from the prime minister office, and then from the president, and then the ambassador. It's a big mess, correct?
Well, look, I would make two general points here. Having worked on Lebanon for many years across the political divide for both Democrats and Republicans, I think that there are 2 points I guess I would make. I mean, first of all, when the U.S. obviously is courted from friends and allies all over the world, and I'd say those who are most effective are those who are able to point to initiatives that they are already doing. That is to say, we tend to do better. We are reactive often when it comes to Lebanon. And those parties who are able to point to activities that they're already undertaking and align them with the United States, that tends to be more effective. So the best example is in 2005, the May 14th movement. That was an indigenous Lebanese movement that we were able to get behind. We're much less effective when we try to initiate policies or try to initiate by ourselves, and that we're not going to do that now in the Middle East. That is not the way we're doing business, and that's why I think it's really important, especially for Lebanese, to understand that for the United States to help them, we have to help those who are helping themselves. And that's, I think the most central point that I would make about, who are most effective when they come to Washington are those who can point to efforts and activities that are already undergoing. And secondly, when they're able to align their objectives with American objectives. Look, I just want to address one point that was just made about where we're heading. It's true. First of all, we don't know if there's going to be a return to the JCPOA or not. I mean, it looks, from today, a very kind of a 50-50 proposition. In either case, as you've asked, your questions have suggested the JCPOA return will not address other major concerns having to do with Iran and Iranian foreign policy and Iranian interests in the region. And what will really be important is how we in the U.S. and how our partners and friends in the region move forward after there is an agreement. I think it's important to note the agreement will be, at best, very flawed, have a lot of holes. As Joel pointed out, will put a lot of money in the Iranian coffers, but presumably will also buy time. And the real critical question then is, what do we do with that time? And if what we do is say, oh, the region is fine, we now have this agreement and we can move on to other concerns elsewhere in the world, then we will squander that time. If, on the other hand, we say, okay, we've managed to buy a little more time than we would have without this agreement, and now it's time to really get serious and deal with a lot of the other issues on the agenda having to do with Iranian misbehavior in the region and power projection and whatnot, then it will be a different reality. I don't think there's anything predetermined here.
Thank you, Robert. Ambassador Gerald, so basically, what's really stopping this deal to happen between, of course, the 5+1 nations and the Iranians?
Well, it is a kind of a murky situation right now. It did appear as though the parties were very close to finalizing an agreement. The Ukraine conflict started. The Russians tried to manipulate the negotiations in order to try to break the Western unity over the Ukraine situation. That hasn't succeeded, but it may have delayed finalizing an agreement, may have even undermined the possibility of finalizing the agreement. It's not clear at this juncture, and so we seem to be in a little bit of a hiatus at the moment as to whether it goes forward or not. But I do want to also reinforce the point that Rob just made, that we shouldn't, when the Biden administration came into office, in fact, if you go back to the 2020 campaign and the statements that President Biden, then candidate Biden, made about the Iran negotiations, his point was that he wanted to extend and strengthen the JCPOA, and that when the administration came into office, it was their initial attempt to try to expand the negotiation to take into account these other issues, the ballistic missile problem, the issue of interference in the internal affairs of neighbors, support for terrorism, that whole basket of concerns that the entire international community has about Iranian behavior, including the U.S., including Democratic and Republican administrations. There's no difference within the U.S. political establishment about what the problems are with Iranian activity. The only difference is what to do about it and how best to approach it and how best do you resolve it. And you know, given the realities of the negotiation, it's clear that the JCPOA is not going to go beyond that limited Iran nuclear issue. But it does leave on the table the requirement for the administration to work with our friends and partners in the region, both the Gulf Arabs, Israel, and others, to try to then work out a strategy for addressing these other problems. And whether you believe that the way to do that is through engagement with the Iranians or to go back to a much harsher sanctions regime is a matter of debate. I would say that neither strategy thus far has actually achieved its objective. The original JCPOA ended before the administration really had an opportunity to see whether engagement would work. The maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration did not succeed in achieving that objective. And so we still have this question about how best to move forward with the Iranians. What is the right strategy? I don't know that anyone has the right answer. And obviously for Lebanon, this is extremely important and central to the future of the Lebanese state because, as Joel said, it raises the whole question of the future of Hezbollah and what role Hezbollah will have as a political entity within the Lebanese framework.
Joseph Shbaili, the election is not far. It's getting closer and closer. Hezbollah is saying that they're going to break the will of the U.S. in Lebanon on May 15th. How do you expand on that quote?
These elections are crucial. I mean, by any standard and by the recognition of different players, whether within Lebanon or abroad. And we saw the statements coming out. I don't remember any period where Lebanese elections were happening where we had all these powerful statements coming from Washington, coming from New York, from the Security Council, the International Support Group, and I can go on, the Arab League, etc. So everybody feels that these elections could determine really the future of Lebanon and whether Lebanon could be salvaged or not. Now the competition is fierce between the what we call the mafia militia, now ruling elite, and the opposition. And I think here I want to highlight a point that Rob made about the messaging coming out from Lebanon, especially within the groups that I would say would agree overall regarding U.S. objectives in Lebanon. When we talk about the free, sovereign, independent Lebanon, free of militias, without foreign occupation. So these groups, when we look at the upcoming elections now, who are calling for sovereignty of the country, who want to fight also corruption, as you can see, are not really united in forming united or unified lists for the elections. So that is its challenge. That's one challenge. The other challenge is the fact that Saad Hariri recused himself from politics or decided to withdraw from politics, but at the same time, he gave the message to the Sunni community at large that we don't want you, particularly a Sunni community that would vote, I guess, for the independence, sovereignty, for fighting militias, etc., and to oppose the current, as I said, elite in the country. So the message was that we don't want you to get involved. We don't want you to vote, which I think is the wrong message at this point, because obviously we need the vote of this community, which again could be important in determining the future of the country. And then thirdly, there's the matter of could there be any tampering, any cheating, any use of violence to derail the elections, especially coming again from Hezbollah and their acolytes in the country. Now, this matter has been addressed to a certain extent by the international community, and I think there will be steps taken to ensure the integrity of the elections. So that's what I would say about the.
Joseph, you have a voice in Lebanon, in Arabic. They say "ما هيتغير شيء," nothing is going to change. And so if nothing is going to change, don't you think that this is the will of the Lebanese people? They don't want to change anything. We always blame the government that they don't want to change its behavior. What about the public? And if Hezbollah won the whole seats like last year, don't you think as well this team is legitimate? And the U.S. has to change its behavior with this team to approach it in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is in the hands of the Lebanese people. Elections in Lebanon. I mean, there are irregularities. There's some cheating, etc. But honestly, in the end, yes, the people elect their representatives in Lebanon, and the parliament is the only institution that's elected by the people, the only central institution. The Lebanese people don't elect the president; they elect the parliament, and the parliament in Lebanon is all powerful. They elect the president. They designate the prime minister. They give confidence to the cabinet. So it's essential that the people of Lebanon vote and vote the right way. They should not abstain from voting, especially the ones who want change. Otherwise, they will pay the price.
Thank you, Joseph. Let's move to Joel. Joel, you're former colleague David Schenker, who started the policy, if we wish to say, as a policy or even a tool to place sanctions on corrupted senior officials or whoever also close to Hezbollah to try to break ties with this what you call it a terrorist group in the US. Here it's a legitimate group represented in a government. Moving forward, Biden also placed some sanctions on people that they are corrupted in Lebanon. Do you think this policy should continue in the future?
I think it should continue.
Is that working in your understanding? Gibran Basir is still running for office. He's head of a political party. He might make a big win in this election. What did it affect him?
No, it's not working. But it's not working because of the specifics of that policy toward Lebanon. The entire situation and U.S. policy in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, toward the Yemen conflict is all suffering from the same affliction, which is that it's being swamped by a very misguided policy concerning the Iranian regime. And none of these local policies that the United States is trying to employ that are essentially the right policies has a hope of achieving its goals if the United States follows through with unfreezing tens of billions of dollars of cash to the Iranian regime that is going to flow disproportionately to the IRGC and therefore disproportionately to exactly the actors the United States is trying to reduce the influence of and isolate in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. And in addition to that, you asked that earlier, why has the Iran deal with the United States not been reached? I think the answer is pretty straightforward. It's because the U.S. administration discarded the leverage that it inherited from the Trump administration and allowed the Iranian regime to generate revenues from oil sales that are now the Iranian regime is now able to sell more than 1 million barrels of oil a day. And it's comfortable in terms of its revenue stream from its oil. When at the peak of the sanctions pressure in the Trump administration, the Iranians were selling less than 300,000 barrels a day, and they were on the verge of financial collapse, that regime. The Biden administration, I think, made the very unfortunate mistake of unilaterally conceding to lift the Houthi foreign terrorist designation without anything in return, and then to basically relax the sanctions enforcement throughout 2021 and now 2022 so that there are revenues flowing to the Iranian regime without a deal. So the Iranian regime doesn't have to be in a hurry to strike a deal on U.S. terms. I think the Biden administration...
Let's not forget the American hostages as well, Joel.
Well, exactly
that left behind. Obama left behind some hostages. And it seems like probably Biden will do the same thing.
Yeah, well, I think every U.S. administration should have done more, could have done more concerning the hostage situation with the Iranian regime, the Assad regime, and Hezbollah over the years. So I don't think the Biden administration or the Obama administration are unique in that. But I think certainly the prospect that there's going to be another kind of ransom deal. I think number one, I want those people to come home. I mean, I was involved in that issue somewhat when I was in the White House during the first year and a half of the Trump administration. I know the anguish from the families, and it's absolutely intolerable, and we should try to get those people home. But if it's done essentially de facto through a ransom payment, as the UK just did for Nazanin Ratcliffe, then you're just encouraging the IRGC and their internal security branch, which is who's responsible for doing that. You just make it. They give them an incentive to restock with hostages again afterwards because they get billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of pounds every time, and it's a state policy of hostage taking that works for them. So you just reinforce that with them. I think there has to be a change of some kind in the U.S.
Joe, since you are here, I want to take advantage. I want to take advantage of your presence here. Do you think Austin Tice is still alive since you worked on Syria file? Yes or no?
Well, look, the U.S. system proceeds on the assumption that he is alive, and frankly, it's intolerable that the Assad regime will not come clean, will not even take the first step toward explaining what has happened to him, where he is now, what his status is, and my personal view, and this was widely shared.
Please, I want
among my
to hear
colleagues.
it.
What was that there can be absolutely not even thinking of normalization with the Assad regime until there is an accounting for what has happened to Austin Tice, and not just Austin, but the other Americans that have disappeared into the Assad regime's custody. I think it has to be the starting point.
Well, Robert Dannon, we see a strong position from the Biden administration regarding what's really happening between UAE and Saudi Arabia with Syria. Biden is still convinced that there should not be any normalization with Syria. Do you agree with this choice, or we open up to Syria since Assad is still in power, nothing changed yet unless more war in the region or in this particular country, and it also has its impact on Lebanon?
Well, yes, I do agree. I don't think I think you'd be very hard pressed to find those who don't, at least here in Washington, across the political divide. This is a regime that has defied so many international norms, has massacred so many of its own people. It's lost its own legitimacy, and I think it's a mistake for us to do anything to legitimize that regime. We do have a small presence still in Syria, in Tanf, that has played a disproportionate role in a positive sense in preserving and advancing American interests, in ensuring that, to the extent possible, that there isn't a backsliding in terms of the war against Daesh and other concerns we have regarding the regime. But, just at a basic moral and humanitarian point of view, it's very hard to see what incentive we have to in any way embrace or move towards the Assad regime and abandon the approach that now has transcended 3 administrations in terms of keeping the Assad regime at arm's length. So,
Robert, I want to ask you just like a simple question, because we all agree on major things that is happening in Lebanon. So, in your opinion, first, as worked on Lebanon's files for many years, what are the obstacles for Lebanon today? Very simple.
Well, there's no such thing as a simple question when it comes to the Middle East, and I think your question just demonstrated that.
For example, corruption, Hezbollah, maybe the people's will don't want to change. It's like the government doesn't want to change its behavior in corruption.
All of the above.
Look, Joe's a medical doctor. This is a patient with multiple afflictions.
So we have a sick body. It's called Lebanon. How can we treat this?
Sadly,
how can we go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think the point is not just to diagnose all the maladies. There are many. We all know them, but it would take us the rest of the program to itemize them. It's to also try to think about what the way out towards rehabilitation for the patient, if you will. And I agree with what Joe said earlier. I think the upcoming elections are an opportunity. We have to be modest about what it can achieve. It's not going to save Lebanon. It's not going to repair all of its ills. But depending on the outcome, it could provide a new government with greater legitimacy. It could actually provide remove Hezbollah's blocking third that so paralyzes much of what's able to get done in Lebanon. So, look, we the United States, we've learned the hard way that especially when it comes to Lebanon, big, dramatic, overarching change is difficult, and that, maybe incremental reform, small measures are possible. Lebanon is in very dire straits. But there are, what is encouraging is that you did have an uprising that came out in October of 2019. That you have Lebanese people who are very active and mobilizing for this election, and that's critical for the Lebanese people to take ownership over their future. And we should be encouraging that. We should be helping, but it cannot be driven by outsiders. It has to be driven inside, and that's why those of us who we've all worked inside government here, other than Joe, who's been very close to government. I mean, the job of government is to seize on the small opportunities that exist and try to advance them. It's very tedious, it's very painstaking, but it's incremental. It isn't, oftentimes, most of the time, it isn't thinking the big thoughts. It's trying to turn the battleship 1 or 2 degrees in a different direction.
What's your thought about the ongoing negotiation regarding the maritime border demarcation? That is also an opportunity for Lebanon to start also a clean page of maybe an opportunity for business, bringing money, a source.
Well, yeah, of course, it's a huge opportunity, but it's a bit curious. I mean, there's a reason that the Lebanese government has not signed on to it, and I don't see any reason to believe that it will seize the opportunity that has existed now for some time. And that's where, unfortunately, one of the problems in dealing with Lebanon for outsiders and for power like the United States is Lebanon encompasses overlapping problems. Some of them are indigenous to Lebanon, the corruption, the all the polarization and stagnation politically and whatnot, economic, whatnot. But at the same time, there's the regional context. And, here, Hezbollah is the perfect embodiment of that, that paradox or that overlap where you have Lebanon, Hezbollah is indigenous to Lebanon, and at the same time is, aligned and associated with larger regional forces with Iran and whatnot. And so the point being that it's very hard to come up with a solution to all of Lebanon's problems in one way.
So I understand from you, to make it just very short, that Lebanese doesn't have a loyalty for their home. Always the loyalty.
No.
You're saying like
I wouldn't. I've not.
I think you have a political party that favors the West, and other political party favors Iran. Some are pro Saudi Arabia, and you don't have like the nationalism, like what we see in Ukraine today, for example. They're dying for their own land. They are defending their home. I was there in Kiev for 38 days. I actually touched it. Sadly, I don't touch it here anymore because everyone has different agenda, different perspective anyways. Let's go to Gerald.
But I think
sorry, go ahead. Please, go ahead.
I disagree with one point here. I mean, it's true the Lebanese do not sufficiently unite around a vision as did the Ukrainian. But the only way for Lebanon to move forward is to unite around a shared Lebanese version. And that's why I think that many people took inspiration from what happened in the streets of Lebanon in October of 2019. So to call them disloyal, I don't think is really fair. I think the real issue is that there isn't a shared vision, and that's what's needed.
Thank you. So when I finish from the last point he made, Robert, here, Gerald, just to make it simple, that the people in Lebanon are afraid that this election will not give any promising results. The people took the street in 2019 hoping for the best, but it's not been translated also in the alliance in the political groups here in Lebanon or the independent. I'm not sure if you've been following, but do you have any opinion about this matter?
Well, just to continue the conversation, and fundamentally, we've seen two kind of popular, kind of reactions to major events over these the first couple of decades of this century. We saw certainly in February of 2005 the popular response to the murder of Rafik al-Hariri, and which is what in fact drove Syria out of Lebanon, and then of course the reaction after the port explosion in 2019, and again this huge outpouring of anger over the failures of the government to undertake their fundamental duties to protect their citizens and to provide even a modicum of oversight of what was going on in the country. So you have those two big, kind of popular explosions of sentiment that crossed all of the divisions. But to reiterate the point that's been made, Lebanon is a deeply divided society. The fact of the matter is that you do have this kind of polarization, and you can't say that this group or that group represents, the true Lebanon or the true nature of the Lebanese political status or framework, and therefore the problem that we have here, and the reason that that issues after that outburst of popular unity and sentiment over what happened at the port, when that settled down, all of the old political divisions resurfaced. And we are back more or less into that same situation that we were in prior to the port explosion. And so there is no clear leader who can speak for all unity. I mean, you use the Ukraine example. Well, there is no Zelensky in Lebanon. And nobody, maybe since Hariri, and even Hariri also had his limitations, but certainly not since Rafiq al-Hariri, have you had somebody who was a dominant political figure in the country who could bring together the various different factions and lead in a direction. And that was a particular circumstance. It was a particular moment in time. It was a particular charismatic individual who was able to do that. And so, until somebody surfaces, until somebody can come up with a vision, as the point has been made, until somebody can articulate a vision that all Lebanese can unite behind, you're going to have these difficult circumstances, difficult political divisions, and very uncertain outcomes from elections. So this is and let's not kid ourselves. This is not a problem that's unique to Lebanon, but it is one that has specific and very difficult results for Lebanon.
Thank you, Ambassador. Joseph Jbali, very quickly, what are the problems you encounter with Lebanese political players regarding your efforts in Washington?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think first of all, there is a misunderstanding of the U.S. policy. The priorities, how it works, the decision makers. So that's one problem that I encounter, and amazingly, even among some leading politicians, there is also this idea about the conspiracy theories, which are very common in Lebanon. You hear things today like things like, oh, Biden is going to hand over Lebanon to Iran. Even I heard something like Lebanon's going to or Biden or the administration is going to hand over Lebanon, and articles by somewhat should be experts in
but Biden
Washington policy.
But Biden kind of gave the chance for the French to take over in some parts to be involved in Lebanon more and more lately, don't you think? With Macron, especially, to form a government.
No, we're talking about handing over, meaning allowing, for example, a foreign country, let's say, to take over Lebanon. Now, when you talk about let's say concerted diplomatic effort with other countries, that's definitely the case for Lebanon, as it could be the case for other countries. Coordinating with France, coordinating with Saudi Arabia, there's definitely an joint effort by France and the US to get the Saudis to be more engaged.
I want to argue with you here. There's a big sense also and fear when Obama came to power and did a deal with Iran. We've seen that Iran became stronger in the region, that behaved in a very unstable manner, unrested manner to the region. We've seen Hezbollah grow stronger 10 times. Of course, there's a fear in Lebanon that Biden will follow the steps of Obama, because nothing changed yet between 2015's deal and today's deal. What's your take on that?
So the response to that is the consequences of certain actions, or the way, and I think Joel alluded to that, and of course Jerry and Rob as well, that if we're going to stop in the negotiation with Iran at just the level of the nuclear deal, and then ignore Iranian interferences in the region, obviously that is a mistake. But it's not. That's different from saying that what I hear sometimes is that, okay, well, it's there's a gift that's happening. Even they say that's the gift happening in Vienna. There's some sort of a secret deal where now the administration or the negotiators are agreeing on handing over Lebanon to Iran. And even I heard it. I was saying earlier. I even heard about handing over Lebanon to Assad, which I don't see the U.S. doing that. So there is a lot of misinformation, and this misinformation is, I think, in a lot of cases, is done on purpose by some people in the media. Hezbollah definitely. One other striking example of this information is the fact that the U.S. is behind the economic crisis in Lebanon. And every expert you talk to will tell you this is the fault of the Lebanese. U.S. has nothing to do with it. But you hear it sometimes from Lebanese who should be knowledgeable about the matter, who tell you, well, okay, maybe the U.S. has some objectives in ruining Lebanese economy for whatever reason. So what I'm trying to say is that there is some sort of a misunderstanding, misconception, disinformation.
Or trust issues sometimes, Joseph. Because
yes, it's a trust issue. Yeah, definitely, and that was my second point.
Of the U.S. and their foreign policies in the past were not very clear in many events.
Yeah, and what I want to highlight here, and
what happened to the Kurds? What happened to the Kurds in Syria, for example? We can go on and on and on.
Yeah. So what you hear sometimes in Washington is that there is a lack of consistency. I mean, there is a lack maybe of long-term vision, and every administration again has a different approach. Even if the general objectives are the same, it could be a different approach. And there is some again criticism regarding this aspect of U.S. policy. You hear it in Washington. And then what I want to say finally is that it has to do with the United States image. Is that yes, it is important for the U.S. to to remedy to that problem. I mean, when you look at the polls. I mean, any poll that you read about the views regarding U.S. policy in Lebanon or the region, and you see them so low. I mean, I read some of the polls recently that said that the Lebanese trust the Russians and the Chinese more than they trust the Americans. This is not good, and this is obviously wrong. And the fault there is not just on the Lebanese. I mean, it's important for the U.S. to have a better public diplomacy to counter these disinformation effort. And we can talk about this a lot, but there's a lot of things that should be done from Washington or in Lebanon when it comes to the image of the United States and its policy.
Can I make a comment about the
Sure.
maritime issue? Because
Yes,
I think that's an important
please,
point.
go ahead.
I want to draw something out.
Would love
Listen,
to.
I came to conclude that there will be no maritime agreement between Lebanon and Israel because Hezbollah does not want one. Hezbollah prefers to have a disputed border with Israel so they can claim to be the resistance, and they're willing to forego even exploiting Lebanon's gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean if that's what it requires. And Nabi Berri, who somehow or another was able to hold the veto over this issue within the Lebanese government, acted in accordance with Hezbollah's constraints, regardless of what Hezbollah officials were saying in public, that their true position was to block any kind of agreement with Israel on this. And so you wound up with the absurd spectacle over the last several months of the Lebanese government asking for what is probably Israeli/Lebanese gas in the Eastern Mediterranean to be not to be exploited by the Lebanese themselves because part of it belongs to them, but rather that Lebanon will take a loan from the World Bank in order to buy what could be Lebanon's gas from somebody else, probably from the Israelis or the Egyptians, and then have it piped across Jordan and Assad, with Assad taking some of this Mediterranean gas in the interest of coming back over to Lebanon. So it's like the Lebanese are reaching around their head to tug their ear, and that's Nabi Berri and Hezbollah doing that. So I think and Nabi Berri doing it and blocking what would be the surest source of revenues for Lebanon.
Is it Hezbollah or Gibran Basir's veto? Because your colleague himself, Davichenko, said
it's Hezbollah.
That he's trying that Gibran Basir is trying to make an exchange deal with the U.S. administration. If they get him out of the sanction, then he will accept any terms that comes to demarcation.
He can't deliver that because Hezbollah is in control of this issue. So I think that's a useless offer from him. But you wind up with, rather than let these revenues come in that could go to the good of the Lebanese public, Nabi Berri, who's one of the richest men in the Middle East, is content to let that source of Lebanese national revenue stay under the sea, and while the Lebanese treasury would pay for it from Lebanese public funds and buy Lebanese gas from somebody else. Is absolutely absurd. But that, in my view, that is the attitude I find throughout many members of the Lebanese political class, the Zuama, whose own interests are completely detached from the interests of the Lebanese people themselves. And it leads to ridiculous policies like that, which in my view, the United States, neither the United States nor France nor anybody else should be enabling. But that's kind of where we are. There are some. Your question about the Lebanese army. I mean, I'm not in favor of cutting the relationship between the United States and the Lebanese army. I do think the United States should use its leverage with the Lebanese army more adroitly, because the Lebanese army suffers from having Hezbollah commissars sprinkled throughout it that are there. They're placed there by Hezbollah, by Wafiq Safa, to try to keep an eye on good, national, patriotic Lebanese officers and units to prevent them from doing their jobs, and to occasionally intimidate them and threaten them with violence or whatever else to prevent them from doing their jobs to see after Lebanese national security. And that's not a sustainable situation for the country. That's where the frustration that you saw in the Trump administration came from, is the presence of the ability of Wafiq Safa to infiltrate into the Lebanese army and have people keep an eye on a Lebanese officer corps that does not want to be, in my view, acting according to Hezbollah's interests. But Hezbollah and the Assad regime have shown that they're willing to kill anybody in Lebanon, including they've killed senior Lebanese army officials in the past. So not just Luqman Salim, but members of the Lebanese armed forces.
I'm not trying to take the side that you are the Trump side or the Republican side, but it's obvious you don't really get along with many policies that the other aisle are placing or addressing. But let me ask you this quickly, please. But don't you feel that this Biden administration is kind of avoiding any tension with Hezbollah, or not trying to address major issues that the country is facing?
Well,
they are more soft on the issue, maybe because of the nuclear deal, the U.S. interest.
Okay, I mean, I made it very clear, not just here, but in public, that I'm in a different place than the Biden administration on a number of policy levels. On some of them, I'm in the same place. But what I will say in their defense is that every U.S. administration comes into office saying, "Wow, the previous administrations got bogged down in these insoluble problems in the Middle East. Let's really reduce the Middle East's importance in our policy sphere and go after things that we think matter more, like the Pacific or trade." And the Middle East just winds up pulling you right back every time. So every administration, I think it takes 1.5 to 2 years for them to recognize reality and say, okay, we actually have to have specific concrete policies that will actually address the sources of these problems in the Middle East, rather than just kind of manage their consequences. So I suspect the Biden administration is on that same trajectory, that they came in not wanting to have to invest a lot of their time and energy in Middle Eastern issues. And God knows, who can blame them? But that the reality check always comes, and you wind up having to have a coherent policy. Look, in the Trump administration, it took us a year and a half to really put together, almost 2 years, to really put together a coherent Syria policy that tried to pull together all the different strands of Syria that were a danger to our interests. And so we wound up with what I think is the right policy. And because there's such a bipartisan consensus on some of these issues, Hezbollah, Assad, the Quds Force, I think you wind up seeing the U.S. come back to a policy that I think is more representative of the views that you get on both sides of the island.
Well, I want to get back to you. I want to go back to you during the recommendation. It's our last part. Dr. Robert Dannon, before your recommendation, just a quick question. It's the same question, basically, a similar question to Joel. Don't you feel that this administration are taking it so easy on Hezbollah versus the past administration?
I think that, to be fair, this administration, like the past administration, is wrestling with a very difficult problem. I don't think there's actually that much difference. I mean, Joel spoke about this ultimatum that Pompeo made and the use of difficult sanctions, which was the right one. But the ultimatum was not carried out, and in the end, the administration continued to deal with Lebanon, to send envoys to Lebanon to meet and continue to try to coax it. I mean, the point is, look, Hezbollah is a formidable force that we don't want to engage in a war over, and we all support 1559 and the other resolutions that call for the disarming of Hezbollah and the return of a single unified army in Lebanon. The question is, how do we get there? Yes, I'd like to see, I think the use of increased sanctions that we saw against individuals was a good start under the past administration, as one that has continued and should be intensified. I think we should use all the tools in our toolbox.
So what about Nabih Berri? What about Nabih Berri, and other players in Lebanon that also been a big partners to Hezbollah from one hand, and question marks on their corrupted activity on the other hand? Gibran Bassi is not only politician, was corrupted in Lebanon.
Sure, and therefore, I think the continuation of sanctioning corrupt individuals in Lebanon should continue, and I think it was important, especially to show that the sanctions sort of are not limited to any one specific confession or political group, that it goes across.
That's the recommendation with you. Let's start with you, Robert. Recommendation.
For whom?
For maybe the U.S. government, key players, how probably they could use some of this recommendation, because we're going to send them apparently to them. Probably they can just shape a bit of their maybe policies in Lebanon. That could be the best for our interests here in Lebanon.
Look, first of all, I just my strongest recommendation is really for the Lebanese. I mean, the demonstration that took place in 2005, what happened in 2019, these were all demonstrations against something. What is the challenge is translating, it's easier to be against something, it's much, much harder to be for something. And I think Lebanon needs to continue to push from within for the things that it does agree upon. And that's, the number one recommendation is to recognize that no outside power, especially the United States, is going to come in and solve your problems for you. That we will work with those who are fighting and working within their own countries for things that they believe in and that align with U.S. Interests and ideals. I mean, for us, what I would like to see is I'd like to see more engagement with the Middle East in general. I think that, in essence, what Joel said is exactly right. If the more we try to sort of disengage from the Middle East, the more it will pull us back. And so therefore, this kind of talk of pivoting from the Middle East, I think is both it's counterproductive actually, because we're not doing it and we're not going to do it. And so but talking about it leaves us in the worst of all possible worlds, leaves us in the region, but perceived to be leaving when we're not. So I think we should, my number one recommendation is to abandon this talk of leaving the Middle East or pivoting away from the Middle East. We've been in the Middle East, we're going to continue to be in the Middle East, and we need to own that and work within work with our partners and allies and continue to do so.
Thank you, Robert. Moving to Ambassador Gerald Feinstein, what would you recommend the U.S. administration, the current one, and also maybe the Lebanese people, since we gave up on our government?
Well, I certainly concur with Rob's views. I think that certainly the U.S. should continue to support those institutions in Lebanon that are working, particularly the LAF, but other elements. I think that the U.S. should prioritize those efforts to help the Lebanese get their economic house in order. That is a central issue. And again, if we're going back to the old vision thing, I think that one issue that perhaps a broad cross-section of the Lebanese public can rally around is, in fact, a concerted effort to address some of these, institutional failures on the economy. We've spent a lot of time talking about the electricity, about the communication system, about some of these deep issues in Lebanon that are amenable to resolution, but have not been resolved. And I think that if the United States tries to focus on those small areas where it can make a difference, where its engagement might help address some of the things that lead to the cynicism and the dysfunctionality of the Lebanese political entity, that might help lead to other things that are more important. Hezbollah is a big issue. Hezbollah is a cancer inside the Lebanese political framework, and how you excise it from the Lebanese political framework is going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of effort. This is not something that's going to be accomplished very quickly or very easily. So we need to work up and try to build a coherent, functioning Lebanese state before we can get on to tackle some of these huge issues.
Thank you, Ambassador. Moving to Dr. Joseph Jbaili. Dr. Joseph, your recommendation for your people and to your U.S. administration. But I just want to add one more thing. Usually we say here in Lebanon that the problem of Hezbollah, it's not a local problem, but it's a regional problem. And you can take it from there.
Well, to answer this first, Hezbollah is a complex problem. It is a local problem. It's also regional. And
no, you don't solve it locally. You have to address it to Iran since it's controlling the proxy. Go ahead.
I think the mistake would be if we don't address all the sources of strength of Hezbollah simultaneously, and I think that's never done before. So Hezbollah, first of all, is strong in the Shia community, and any party, any group that has control of a significant part of its own community in Lebanon will be a power player in the country. So there's no doubt about it. So we have a problem to address within the Shia community. Is there alternative for Hezbollah? Is there other group who are willing to stand up within the Shia community and expose what Hezbollah is doing to the community and to the country? So we have to look for this alternative. That's one. Secondly, it's the whole political alliances of Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah has 12 members in the parliament. It's 10% of the parliament. They have 2 members in the cabinet. They should not be able to control the country politically. Still, they are able to. Why? Because they created this network of alliances with political parties, including the FPM and others. And these alliances should be broken. Because without these alliances, Hezbollah would not have the strength that it has in Lebanon. And thirdly, it's the support from abroad. It's Iran with the money and the weapons. So all three should be addressed. Part of it has to do with the Lebanese. Again, I echo what my co-panelists were saying earlier, there's a lot of things for the Lebanese to do. And of course, there's a lot of actions to be in the responsibility of the international community. I mean, you have these resolutions. You have a resolution that says no country, 1701 says, no state should be sending weapons in Lebanon without the authority of the Lebanese government. Iran is doing it all the time, and everybody knows that.
And no one is stopping them.
And no one is stopping them. No one is even mentioning
It's nice to just mention resolution and support a resolution, but we don't really put a framework to stop these activities.
So, I mean, of course, you have to have, and here we have to understand when you talk about, what the U.S. can do, we have to understand, we have to see the limitations of U.S. policy. Of course, the U.S. is a great power. It has a lot of tools. It has the capability, the use of force. It has a lot of money to also provide assistance.
But we have to understand that its priority.
And a strong diplomatic force also. But it has also its limitations.
True.
The U.S. needs international partners. The revolution Rob was talking about, it was a huge success. Why it succeeded? Yes, the U.S. has a partner starting with France. They were a big partner in the 1559 resolution and forcing the Syria out. They had regional partners at the time, the administration. Saudi Arabia and others were willing to, and you don't have to have everybody. Even if the country is divided, or even if the region is divided, you don't have to have everybody on your side. But you have to have a significant number, or at least some strong players on your side. And finally, you have to have at least part of the Lebanese population. I call it the critical mass. You have to have a significant part of the Lebanese population also supporting those policies. And then you can succeed. So this, for example, is the way to fight Hezbollah and to defeat them. You have to have all those three components.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph Jbaili. Let's get the last recommendation from Joel Rayburn. Joel.
Yeah, I have three recommendations, and they're pretty specific, because I don't think that it's possible for the U.S. to have a comprehensive strategy and policy toward Lebanon or anywhere else where we're contesting Iranian influence until the overall policy with Iran is settled. Frankly, I think that the current policy that the administration is on is going to collapse of its own weight, because if it happens like it happened last time, the IRGC is going to take the windfall from sanctions relief and then escalate its war against the region. So that leads me to my first recommendation, which is I think the region is in danger of the danger of a regional war is very high in the future because of that, because of the almost certainty that the IRGC will take either the increased revenues that they're already getting from oil sales or the unfrozen cash, and they will use it to continue their regional campaign against Israel, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others who are allies of the United States, and that's going to greatly increase the risk of a war. So where this would come home to Lebanon is when the Iranians are in that war, they're going to want to be able to deploy Hezbollah against Israel from Lebanon. They're going to want to deploy them everywhere, Yemen, like they already are there, and Iraq, and so on. And I think now the opposition, or those who call themselves the opposition in Lebanon, need to start preempting that now by saying, look, there's a risk of war, and Hezbollah the Iranian regime is going to call Hezbollah's number and want them to enter into this war and make Lebanon the battleground of this Iranian war, and to start making Hezbollah pay the political price in advance for that, to try and increase the political cost to Hezbollah for doing that on behalf of the Iranians, and maybe discouraging it from happening, although I think it's very difficult. Secondly, I think the Lebanese opposition ought to be pushing the United States and the international community and offering cooperation on cracking down and trying to kill the Hezbollah and Assad regime Captagon trade, which is generating billions of dollars of revenue for each of Assad and Hezbollah right now. And if it could be disrupted, would be a major body blow to both Assad and Hezbollah, as well as the IRGC. And that's something I think the United States is already inclined to do. The Europeans, the Mediterranean countries, and the Gulf countries already inclined to do, but they need a push to try to organize this and create a coalition to do it. But I think it's significant enough that it should happen. The third thing I would do if I was the Lebanese opposition right now is I would reopen the issue of the special tribunal on Lebanon, which is just sort of dying a quiet death right now, because the international community, as Hezbollah came under, as the Lebanese government came under the domination of Hezbollah, and particularly on this policy point, international partners of the STL have just sort of let it fizzle out, including, for example, UK officials on the management committee, which I don't understand. But if I were the Lebanese opposition, I would be pushing to reopen the issue and to begin presenting the evidence to link, for example, the murder of Luqman Salim, the murder of Mohammed Chattah, to the same perpetrators or the same system of perpetrators that were guilty of Hariri and the other cases that were included under the STL, and not let the STL go into the night, but keep it rather as something to, first of all, to get justice for those victims of Hezbollah, Assad, etc., but also to keep it as a sword of Damocles over the head of Nasrallah, Wafiq Safa, Talal Hamia, and other people like that. Don't let them get away with just having this accountability issue fizzle out. And I think it could become more significant in the future than people might guess.
With the Joel Rayburn recommendation, we come to an end for this program between Beirut and Washington, discussing U.S. policy priorities and trivialities in Lebanon. Thanks, Dr. Jeff Bailey. Thanks, Ambassador Gerald Feinstein, Dr. Robert Denon, and at last, Joel Rayburn. Thank you so much for this interesting conversation. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Good seeing you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.